Hi everyone, I'm Jack Cush, executive editor of RheumNow.com. This is the 4th of November and this is the RheumNow Week in Review. It's Halloween week. If you saw my Halloween arthritis video, I'm sorry about the scary mask, but it was in keeping with the times. This week in the news, a report of drug-induced cutaneous lupus. So drug-induced lupus, but only of the cutaneous type, reviewed in 88 patients from one center and showed that the most commonly indicted drugs for that condition were the PPIs, the proton pump inhibitors, thiazide diuretics, antifungal drugs, chemotherapy drugs, statins, anti-epileptics. These are far afield from the old, most commonly known drug-induced lupus drugs like procainamide and others. So we do certainly know that TNF inhibitors are another common new entity that does cause drug-induced lupus. But in this case, again, cutaneous manifestations, and many of these actually showed up as subacute cutaneous lupus, especially in the case of PPIs and thiazide diuretics. Um, a recent and timely survey of U.S. rheumatologists showed that 9 out of 10 surveyed rheumatologists indicated that they would consider switching from an originator biologic to a biosimilar when that becomes available. We now have 4 drugs approved in the marketplace, one soon to arrive on the shelves. Although there is still concern about the process by how these are going to be used and how they'll be received, it seems that the majority are poised to use these drugs, especially if they're forced to. A nice review of pyoderma gangrenosum and its related conditions indicates that pyoderma gangrenosum, a pustular neutrophilic dermatosis that often has a number of clinical associations, including inflammatory bowel disease, does associate with other diseases that are well known to be autoinflammatory diseases, suggesting that all of them may very well be autoinflammatory. This includes conditions like PAPA syndrome, which is pyogenic arthritis, pyoderma gangrenosum with acne, the Sappho syndrome. Of course, all of these are rare. Sappho being synovitis, acne, pustulosis, and hyperostosis, often affecting amphiarthroses, joints of the manubriosternal, sternoclavicular, acromioclavicular joints, sliding saddle joints. The PASH syndrome, which is a syndrome that includes pyoderma gangrenosum, acne, and hidradenitis suppurativa. Again, all of these are unique in that many of them are autoinflammatory conditions. Many of them involve either polymorphisms of the PST-PIP1 and 2 genes or overactivity of one of those genes that leads to inflammasome activation and excessive IL-1 production, which is part of the pathogenesis of these disorders. So a nice review of that particular problem. A review of nearly 1,000 patients from one center looking at the differences between pediatric lupus and adult lupus showed some interesting distinctions. Number one, adult or mature onset lupus was more likely to be associated with leukopenia, arthritis, and a lower incidence of neuropsychiatric lupus, whereas kids overall had worse disease. So juvenile onset SLE were more likely to have renal disease, alopecia, oral ulcers, hematologic abnormalities other than leukopenia, CNS or neuropsychiatric lupus, autoantibodies across the board, and even higher mortality rates. So pediatric lupus is probably a more homogeneous condition and more prone to more severe disease. There's some interesting reports that came out this week. Again, just a few case reports, but they make you raise your eyebrow and wonder. This includes rare reports of tocilizumab-induced pancreatitis. There's a single case report, which is nice and neat and interesting to read, but how often are you going to see this? They actually went one step further and through a Freedom of Information Act retrieval, got the MedWatch data, the adverse event reporting system, and identified 52 more cases of tocilizumab-induced pancreatitis. Turns out that about 70% of those cases were acute pancreatitis, and there certainly are flaws in this kind of reporting. These never really showed up in the thousands of patients that were treated in the tocilizumab trials, but sometimes you need post-marketing data to find new signals. So keep your eyes open to that possibility, although I think it's again, how would this happen? It might be through the related hyperlipidemia that is seen with the use of tocilizumab. Another interesting case report were 2 cases of belimumab treatment that was followed by the onset of lupus nephritis. These occurred 2 or 3 months after the use of belimumab, the initiation of belimumab, and in one case was a class 3 glomerulonephritis, and the other one was a class 5 glomerulonephritis. So thus, they were biopsy proven. So it's interesting to see that that the drug that's being used to treat lupus may in fact cause new manifestations of lupus. This is important because, again, where belimumab fits in the treatment of lupus, I think is yet to be truly defined. But is it the wrong drug, or do they not give enough of this, or give it too late? There are a lot of factors involved in this, but again, it's food for thought. There's a nice new report of a new gout drug that's entering phase 2 trials called SEL-12 or SEL-12. This is a non-immunogenic form of pegsiticase, another version of pegylated uricase. In this case, it's pegsiticase is being combined with rapamycin, an immunosuppressant that would presumably suppress the development of anti-PEG antibodies. Again, this is entering phase 2. It would obviously be a competitor to the existing drug pegloticase, also known as Krystexxa. Other interesting news items include a report from MMWR about inflammatory bowel disease through the NIHS survey system being done by the CDC and reported periodically. In 1999, they found that there was an estimated 1.8 million Americans who had inflammatory bowel disease, including Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and that the most recent survey, again, these are telephone surveys of 40,000 households thought to be representative of the general population, they found 3.1 million cases, suggesting a significant increase in the number of inflammatory bowel diseases in the US. Why? That's not the nature of this particular study. A Wall Street Journal article had a nice piece on how you can take a cheap generic, combine it with another cheap generic, and make a brand new trade name expensive drug. They gave a number of different examples, but the examples that are germane to rheumatology include 2 drugs, one Duexis, which is a combination of ibuprofen and famotidine, and the other being Vimovo, which is naproxen with a PPI. While all other drugs cost $20 to $60, these cost nearly $2,000. I think many rheumatologists are not aware of the cost of these and should alert their patients if they are going to use samples of these or promote the drug by giving a prescription. A nice report from Cassie Calabrese on how IgA, ACPA, and plasmablasts found in preclinical RA may point to the microbiome as being very much involved in the pathogenesis of RA. She reports on an A&R paper authored by Kinslow and colleagues, where they looked at 3 groups: control groups, healthy people, an at-risk population of those people who are probably first-degree relatives with an antibody present, and early RA patients. And what they found by looking at plasmablast and ACPA analyses, they found that there was a much higher frequency of IgA plasmablasts in those who had preclinical at-risk disease, not way more than the early RA patients. Also in that preclinical at-risk population, they had higher levels of IgA CCP3 antibodies. All of these, being IgA, point to the role of mucosal immunity and possibly the gut, and therefore the gut microbiome may be more involved in the pathogenesis of RA than we currently believe. Interesting step forward in this particular area of investigation. Also a very interesting report, we reported on this from the EULAR meeting, about the use of CD4 T cell counts to look at responses to rituximab. You know, rituximab is an anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody, and it depletes B cells for certain for at least 6 months and maybe as long as 12 months. But how that translates into control of disease is really speculative. A group of French investigators were phenotyping, lymphocyte phenotyping their patients, in particular, I think 54 patients, and showed that those patients who responded were more likely to have significant drops in their CD4 T cell counts with these infusions, and they would come back up. And more importantly, found that those people who did not significantly decrease their CD4 T cell counts were also the patients who didn't respond to rituximab, suggesting that this could be a potential biomarker for efficacy or non-efficacy in patients receiving rituximab. More research is needed. This is certainly a pilot trial, but it's a novel look at maybe how these drugs may be working. And lastly, maybe the news of the week are the new gout guidelines published in the American College of Physicians Journal, the Annals of Internal Medicine. The ACP has a guideline committee set up to look at the treatment of gout. Interestingly, when I look at the guideline committee names, I see no rheumatologists in that group. And they came up with guidelines that have engendered quite a bit of discussion, a lot of criticism from leading rheumatologists in this area. Many, including Lenny Calabrese, have called these wishy-washy and sort of silly guidelines. Their main guidelines, 4 recommendations, were that you should treat acute gout with prednisone, nonsteroidals, or colchicine. And 2, if you use colchicine, you should use it in low doses. 3, if you're going to treat acute gout, you should not start urate-lowering therapy with the first attack. And 4, if you're going to use urate-lowering therapy for recurrent attacks, you need to counsel the patient about the benefits and hazards and costs of therapy. I mean, these are all no-brainers that you found in textbooks 20 years ago, yet they have 4 papers in the current issue of Annals of Internal Medicine looking at this. Obviously, much ado about nothing, but really importantly, there's a nice editorial that you should read by Doctors Miyoji and Ted Mickles, who looked at the guidelines and pointed out that the guidelines from the ACP are really not in sync with the 2012 guidelines from the American College of Physicians, which were well thought out. More importantly, they sort of lessen the importance of a treat to target strategy and instead advocated for a sort of treat, according to activity and demand, more or less. They called the treat to target strategy a low priority, or low evidence. And our rheumatologist commented back, said at least it's moderate evidence of effectiveness. So again, these ACP internist-based guidelines really are not gaining much favor with the rheumatology community. So that's it for this week at RheumNow.com. You can go to the website and find the links to these articles and more. Please go to the website and sign up and register if you would. That would do me a great favor. And starting next week, we'll actually have expanded coverage of the American College of Rheumatology meeting that starts on Sunday, the 13th of November. We'll be doing expanded new novel coverage from the 13th through the 17th. Watch for that in your mailbox. Take care. Have a good weekend.